The mud of Blackwater Ridge was not merely earth and water, it was a living, malevolent slurry that swallowed boot heels and hope with equal indifference. It was a town built on the promise of silver that had never materialized, leaving behind a skeleton of grey timber and men with hollow eyes. Ilara Vance stood in the alley behind the livery stable, the freezing slush seeping through the holes in her boots. She was 26, though the hunger that had gnawed at her for months made her look older, sharper. Her coat was a thin, woolen thing, 3 sizes too big, held together at the waist with a piece of fraying rope. A heavy scarf was wrapped around her head, obscuring the right side of her face, the side the fire had taken 5 years ago. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the bone-deep weakness of starvation. "Please, mister," Ilara whispered to the stable hand, who was tossing hay into a trough. "I can muck the stalls. I can polish the tack. I don't need coin. Just something warm to eat." The stable hand, a boy of no more than 16 with acne-scarred cheeks, looked at her. He looked at her trembling hands, red and raw from the cold. Then he looked at the scarf. "Let's see the face," he sneered, leaning on his pitchfork. "Boss don't hire monsters." Ilara shrank back, clutching the scarf tighter. "I work hard," she pleaded. "I'm strong." "Show me," the boy insisted, stepping closer. "Or get lost." Ilara hesitated. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the wet wool of her coat. Slowly, with shaking fingers, she lowered the scarf. The boy recoiled. His face twisted in disgust. The scar was a map of agony, a jagged, melted landscape of pink and white tissue that ran from her temple to her jaw, pulling her right eye slightly downward and twisting her lip. It was the mark of the tenement fire that had taken her parents and her beauty in a single night. "Jesus!" the boy spat, turning away. "Get out of here! You'll spook the horses!" He scooped up a clod of freezing mud and threw it at her. It struck her shoulder with a wet thud. Ilara didn't cry out. She didn't have the energy. She simply turned and stumbled away, back into the main thoroughfare where the wind whipped down from the peaks like a razor. She walked past the saloon, the smell of roasting meat wafting out to torment her. She walked past the general store, where women in fine dresses looked through her as if she were a ghost. She reached the edge of town, where the boardwalk ended and the true wilderness began. Her legs gave out. She collapsed into the slush near a hitching post, her vision swimming with black spots. This is it, she thought, a strange calm settling over her. The cold will be kind. It will just be sleep. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. "That's a fine way to die," a voice rumbled above her. "But you're blocking my wagon." Ilara blinked, forcing her eyes open. Towering over her was a man who looked like he had been carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. Silas, the stone, Kincaid. He wore a coat of heavy buffalo hide that made his shoulders look as wide as a barn door. His hat was pulled low, dripping with melting snow, but beneath the brim, eyes the color of slate watched her without pity, without disgust, just with a cold, hard assessment. He was loading sacks of flour into a buckboard wagon, his movements efficient and powerful. Ilara scrambled to her knees, the survival instinct flaring one last time. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, trying to pull her scarf back over her face. "I was just resting." "You were freezing," Silas corrected flatly. He threw another sack into the wagon. It landed with a heavy thump. Ilara looked at him. He didn't look like the townfolk. He smelled of pine resin, gun oil, and deep, solitary silence. Do you need help?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can lift. I can work. I'm strong, sir. I swear it." Silas stopped. He looked at her properly now. He looked at her raw, bleeding knuckles. He looked at the scarf she was desperately trying to hold in place. "Let it go," he said. "Sir?" "The scarf. Let it go." Ilara froze. But there was something in his voice, not a command of cruelty but of practicality, that made her obey. She let the wool fall. Silas looked at the scar. He didn't flinch. He didn't grimace. He studied it like a man studying a fence line for weakness. "Fire," he stated. "Yes," Ilara whispered. "5 years ago." "Does it hurt?" "Only when it's cold." "It's always cold where I live," Silas said. He turned back to the wagon. "I have a ranch, high country, 3,000 acres of rock and snow. It kills weak things." "I am not weak," Ilara said, a spark of defiance cutting through her exhaustion. "I survived the fire. I survived this town. I can survive the snow." Silas looked at her again. He seemed to be weighing something heavy in his mind. "I don't need a worker," he said slowly, his voice deep and vibrating with a strange tension. "I have hands for the cattle. Men who sleep in the bunkhouse and smell like wet dogs." Ilara's heart sank. "Oh, I see." She turned to crawl away, back to the oblivion of the snow. "I need a wife," Silas said. Ilara stopped. She turned back, her mouth falling open. What?" "A wife," Silas repeated. He walked around the wagon and stood in front of her. He blocked the wind. "The mayor. Pims. He's trying to take my land. Dug up an old tax law. Widower's tax. Says a man with no family can't hold more than 1,000 acres. He wants the water rights." He looked at the gray sky, his jaw tightening. "I need a paper. Wife. Someone to sign the deed. Someone to cook the meals and keep the fire so the law can't say the house is empty. I don't need love. I don't need softness. I need a signature and a spine." He looked down at her, at the scar that made the world reject her. "You have no one," he stated, "and you're starving. I have food, I have a roof, and I have a ring in my pocket that belonged to a woman who is dead." He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple gold band. "Marry me," Silas said, "and you'll never beg for bread again. But it will be a hard life." "I am a hard man." Ilara stared at the ring. It was a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. It was a business transaction, cold and stark. But looking into Silas Kincaid's slate-grey eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in 5 years. He wasn't looking at the monster. He was looking at the survivor. Ilara swallowed, her throat dry. "I can cook, and I can keep a fire. Is that a yes?" Ilara nodded. "Yes." Silas didn't smile. He nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Get in the wagon," he said. "The parson is terrified of me. This won't take long." He offered her a hand, large, calloused, and surprisingly warm. Ilara took it. And as he pulled her up onto the seat, the first heavy flakes of the blizzard began to fall, sealing her fate to the stone-faced stranger who had bought a wife to save a mountain. Gemini said, "The ascent into the high country was a journey not measured in miles, but in the brutal subtraction of warmth." The wagon, a heavy, iron-rimmed buckboard that groaned under the weight of the supplies, climbed switchbacks so steep that the horse's breath plumed like steam engines in the freezing air. Ilara sat on the hard wooden bench, wrapped in a buffalo. Robe Silas had tossed at her without a word. The wool of her own coat was damp and useless against the wind that howled down from the peaks, a wind that carried the scent of ice and ancient pine. She clutched the side of the wagon, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the back of the mules. She didn't dare look at the man beside her. Silas drove with a terrifying, silent competence. He didn't speak to the animals, he guided them with the subtle tension of the leather reins in his gloved hands. He was a statue carved from the landscape, indifferent to the cold that was making Ilara's teeth chatter in a rhythm she couldn't control. "I am a wife," she thought, the absurdity of it twisting in her empty stomach. "I signed a paper in a room that smelled of ink and fear, and now I belong to the mountain." The ring on her finger felt heavy, cold, and foreign. It was a simple band of gold, scratched and worn, warming slowly against her skin, a ghost's jewelry on a scarred hand. climbed for hours. The trees changed from the deciduous scrub of the valley to towering Douglas firs, their branches heavy with snow. The light began to fail, turning the world into a monochromatic etching of grey rock and white drifts. Finally, the wagon crested a ridge. "Home," Silas grunted. It was the first word he had spoken in 10 miles. Ilara looked up. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress against God and nature. Nestled in a bowl of granite, protected by a hanging cliff face, stood a cabin built of black pine logs the width of whiskey barrels. It was low, squat, and looked as if it had grown out of the rock itself. A chimney of river stones belched nothing. The fire was dead. To the left, a barn loomed in the shadows, its doors shut tight. To the right, the land dropped away into a canyon so deep the bottom was lost in darkness. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard. The mud here was frozen solid, crunching under the wheels. He set the brake. He jumped down, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He didn't offer a hand. He walked to the back of the wagon and shouldered a 50-pound sack of flour as if it were a pillow. "Inside," he commanded, jerking his head toward the dark cabin. "Doors unlocked. Nobody comes up here but wolves." Ilara scrambled down, her legs stiff and unresponsive. She slipped on the ice, catching herself on the wheel. Silas didn't turn. He was already marching toward the porch. She followed him, shivering violently. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside was colder than the air outside. It was a stillness. That felt entombed. The cabin was a cavern. The only light came from the grey twilight filtering through 2 small, grime-streaked windows. As her eyes adjusted, the neglect revealed itself not as filth, but as a profound masculine emptiness. There were no curtains, no rugs. The floor was rough-hewn planking, scattered with pine needles and dried mud from boots that never wiped. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, cold and dark. A table in the center of the room was piled with harnesses, a disassembled Winchester rifle, and a tin plate crusted with days-old grease. It smelled of gun oil, stale coffee, curing leather, and the damp, musty scent of a house that had forgotten the sound of a voice. Silas walked past her, dumping the flour onto the table. He struck. A match on the sole of his boot, the flare of phosphorus briefly illuminating his harsh face. He lit a kerosene lamp hanging from a rafter. The yellow light chased the shadows into the corners, revealing a ladder leading to a loft and a closed door on the main floor. "That's your room," Silas said, pointing to the closed door. His voice echoed in the silence. "I sleep in the loft." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "The deal is simple, Ilara. You keep the fire. You cook the meals. You sign the papers when the mayor comes sniffing around." He walked to the hearth and kicked a log into place, but didn't light it. "I don't expect conversation," he continued, his slate eyes boring into her. "And I don't expect softness. This is a working ranch. You stay out of the barn unless the house is burning down. You stay out of my way." He walked to the door, pulling his gloves tighter. "I have to check the herd in the south pasture. The storm is bringing the drift. I'll be back when I'm back." "Mr. Kincaid?" Ilara whispered, her voice cracking. He stopped, his hand on the latch. "Silas. The name on the paper is Silas. Is there food?" Silas looked at the larder shelves, bare except for a few tins and a sack of coffee. "Cellar door is under the rug," he said. "Potatoes, maybe some salt." "Pork, make it last," the door slammed. The heavy bar didn't fall. He hadn't locked her in. But the silence that rushed back into the room felt like a prison cell all the same. Ilara stood alone in the center of the room. She was trembling with exhaustion, her stomach twisted with a hunger so sharp it felt like a knife. He bought a wife, she thought, looking at the grim surroundings. But he treats me like a ghost he's trying to ignore. She could have collapsed. She could have crawled into the room he offered and slept until the cold took her. But Ilara Vance had survived the fire. She had survived the streets of Blackwater. Ridge. She was not going to die in a cabin full of flour and wood. She moved. She found the woodbox. It was full. She knelt before the massive hearth, her hands shaking as she arranged the kindling. She struck a match, precious, terrifying fire, and held it to the birch bark. The flame caught. It grew. The chimney drew with a low roar, sucking the smoke up and out. Heat. Ilara sat before it for a moment, letting the warmth soak into her bones, feeling the blood return to her frozen fingers. The pain of the thaw was excruciating, 1,000 needles pricking her skin, but it was the pain of life. She stood up. She took off her heavy coat and the scarf, revealing the scar to the empty room. She went to work. She found the trapdoor under a filthy bearskin rug. She descended into the root cellar. It smelled of earth and rot. In the darkness, her hands found a bin of potatoes. They were old, wrinkled like the knuckles of an old man, and sprouting eyes. But they were food. She filled her apron. She found a slab of salt pork hanging from a hook, hard as a rock. Back upstairs, she found a pot. It was coated in dust. She scrubbed it with snow from the windowsill, and a rag she found near the wash basin. She peeled the potatoes, her knife moving, with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Slice, chop, drop. She put the pork and potatoes in the water. She set the pot on the iron hook over the fire. While the soup began to heat, she turned her attention to the room. The chaos was offensive to her. It was the chaos of a man who was waiting to die. She found a broom made of stiff twigs. She swept. She swept the mud from the floor. She swept the cobwebs from the corners. She organized the harness leather into a neat pile. She wiped the grease from the table until the wood grain, beautiful dark oak, shone in the firelight. Then she saw his coat, not the buffalo coat he was wearing, but a heavy wool riding coat thrown over the back of a chair. It was grey, thick, and well made, but the sleeve was torn almost completely off at the shoulder, likely snagged on barbed wire or a tree branch. Ilara ran her finger along the tear. It was a jagged wound in the fabric. He walks around like iron, she thought, but he lets the wind in right at the shoulder. She found a tin box on the mantel. Inside was a spool of heavy black thread and a bone needle. She sat by the fire, the soup bubbling with a savory, salty scent that made her mouth water. She pulled the heavy coat into her lap. Threading the needle was a battle. Her hands were scarred and stiff, and her right eye watered in the smoke. But she persisted. Lick the thread. Steady the hand. Push. She began to stitch. Her stitches weren't the delicate embroidery of a lady. They were the functional, locking stitches of a tenement worker. Over, under, pull. Over, under, pull. Hours passed. The wind outside rose to a shriek, rattling the shutters, trying to find a way in. But inside, the cabin was holding. The latch clicked. Ilara froze. The needle halfway through the wool. The door swung open. A gust of snow blew in, swirling across the clean floor. Silas Kincaid stepped inside. He was covered in white. His beard was a block of ice. He looked like a snowman built around a core of granite. He stomped his boots, expecting the crunch of grit. His boot hit clean wood. He stopped. He lifted his head. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the smell of cold ash and loneliness. It was the rich, thick scent of potato soup and rendering pork fat. It was the smell of warmth. He looked at the table. It was cleared. A bowl and spoon were set out, not for one, but for two. He looked at the fire. It was roaring, casting a golden glow over the room that softened the harsh edges of the logs. Then he looked at Ilara. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth. The scarf was gone. The firelight played across the right side of her face, illuminating the jagged, shiny ridges of the burn scar. She didn't turn away. She didn't hide it. In her lap was his grey coat. Silas walked slowly into the room, the door drifting shut behind him. He pulled off his gloves, his fingers red and stiff. He walked to her. He looked down at the coat. He saw the shoulder. The tear was gone. A neat, black scar of thread held the fabric together, stronger than it had been before. He looked at her. Hands. He saw the blister forming on her thumb from pushing the heavy needle through the wool. "I didn't ask you to mend," Silas said. His voice was rough, cracking with the cold, and something else, surprise perhaps, or discomfort. "A wife mends," Elara said softly, biting the thread to break it. She stood up, holding the coat out to him. "And a worker earns her keep. I told you, Silas. I am both." Silas stared at the coat, then at her. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a pressure behind his sternum. He was used to the cold. He was used to the dark. He wasn't used to coming home to a fire he hadn't built. He took the coat. He hung it on the peg. "Soup smells adequate," he grumbled, turning his back to her to hide the fact that his eyes were stinging from the sudden thaw. He walked to the table and sat down. He picked up the spoon. Elara watched him, her heart pounding. She had passed the first test. She had made the fortress a home. But as she watched the stone-faced man eat the soup she had made from his scraps, she realized the hardest part wasn't surviving the cold outside. It was surviving the cold inside him. The blizzard that hammered Blackwater Ridge 3 nights later did not arrive with a howl. It arrived with a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. The wind, which had been stripping the needles from the pines for 2 days, abruptly shifted, turning into a whiteout fury that erased the world. The temperature plummeted until the logs of the cabin groaned and popped like rifle shots as the sap froze deep within the wood. Silas had been restless all evening. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters. He moved with a heavy, dragging energy that Elara, sitting by the fire peeling potatoes, tracked with her eyes. "The stallion," Silas grunted, staring at the window, where the frost was thickening into an opaque curtain. "He's spooked. I can hear him kicking the stall. If he breaks a leg, we lose the breeding stock." Elara looked up. "It's a whiteout, Silas. You can't see your hand in front of your face." "Stock doesn't care about the weather," he snapped, grabbing his heavy coat and a coil of rope. "Keep the fire high. If I'm not back in an hour, don't come looking. You'll die in the drift." He opened the door. The wind shrieked, tearing the heat from the room instantly. He stepped out, and the white darkness swallowed him whole. Elara barred the door. She went back to the potatoes, but her hands were shaking. She listened. An hour passed, then 2. The silence of the cabin, usually a comfort, became a threat. Elara stood up. She paced to the window. Nothing but blackness and the swirling ghosts of snow. He said, "Don't come looking," she told herself. He said I would die. But she remembered the look in his eyes when he talked about the land. It wasn't greed. It was survival. And without him, she was just a scarred woman in a frozen tomb. She waited 10 more minutes. Then she moved. She grabbed her coat, the thin one, and wrapped a heavy wool blanket over it. She grabbed the lantern, she unbarred the door and pushed. The wind fought her, slamming the heavy oak back, but she leaned her shoulder into it. She slipped out into the maelstrom. The cold was a physical blow. It sucked the air from her lungs. She couldn't see the barn, only feel the faint vibration of the ground. She followed the guide rope Silas had strung between the house and the stable, gripping it with frozen fingers, pulling herself hand over hand through thigh-deep drifts. She reached the barn door. It was ajar, banging rhythmically against the frame. Bang, bang, bang. "Silas!" she screamed, the wind snatching the name away. She slipped inside. The air here was warmer, thick with the smell of hay, manure, and terrified animals. She raised the lantern. The stallion's stall was shattered. Splintered wood lay everywhere. The massive black horse was pacing nervously, his eyes rolling white. And there in the straw lay Silas. He wasn't moving. Elara dropped the lantern, thankfully it didn't break, and scrambled over the partition. "Silas!" She fell to her knees beside him. He was curled on his side, his face grey, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that bubbled with something wet. He opened his eyes. They were glassy, unfocused. Ribs, he wheezed, clutching his side. Kicked. Lung. He tried to push himself. Up, but a groan of pure agony tore from his throat, and he collapsed back into the straw. The cold of the unheated barn was seeping into him fast. Shock was setting in. "We have to get up," Ilara said, her voice trembling but fierce. "You will freeze here." "Can't," Silas gasped. "Leave me. Bar the door." "No." Ilara grabbed his arm. "I am not a widow yet, Silas Kincaid. Get up." She pulled. She was small, weakened by years of hunger, but adrenaline is a powerful fuel. Silas groaned, gritting his teeth until they threatened to crack, and forced himself to his knees. He leaned his entire massive weight on her. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare of inches. Every step was a battle against the wind and gravity. Ilara dragged him, her boots slipping, her breath sobbing in her throat. Silas stumbled, half-conscious, his boots dragging through the snow. "Just one more step," she chanted. "Just one more." They hit the porch. Ilara kicked the door open. They fell inside together, a tangle of snow and limbs, collapsing onto the floorboards in front of the hearth. Ilara didn't rest. She kicked the door shut and threw the bar. She turned to him. He was shivering violently now, the shock and the cold taking hold. "I have to get this coat off," she muttered, her fingers fumbling with the frozen buttons. She stripped him down to his long johns. His right side was a mess of purple and black bruising, swelling rapidly. He hissed in pain when she touched it. "Broken," he rasped. 3, maybe 4. "I'm going to bind it," Ilara said, trying to keep her voice steady. She tore a sheet from the bed into strips. She bound his chest tight, listening to him stifle screams. She dragged the mattress from the bedroom to the fire. She couldn't get him to the loft and rolled him onto it. She piled every fur and blanket in the house on top of him. Then the fever came. It wasn't the injury, it was the exposure. By midnight, Silas was burning. His skin was dry and hot as parchment. He thrashed in the furs, fighting invisible enemies. "The water," he mumbled, his voice thick with delirium. "They took the water rights. Don't let them sign." Ilara sat beside him, dipping a rag into a bowl of snowmelt. She bathed his forehead. She trickled water between his cracked lips. "Shh," she soothed, stroking his hair that was usually so stiff with cold, now soft with sweat. "The water is safe, Silas. Sleep." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was bruising. "Mary," he whispered, staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Mary, I tried. The snow was too deep. I couldn't find the doctor." Ilara froze. Mary, his first wife, the woman the ring belonged to. "I'm so sorry," Silas wept, tears leaking. From his eyes to track through the grime on his face. "I failed you. I let the fire go out." Ilara's heart broke. This mountain of a man, this stone, was carrying a boulder of guilt that had crushed him long before the horse kicked him. He thought he had let his family die. She leaned forward. She didn't pull away. She placed her other hand over his, trapping, his large, rough hand between hers. "You didn't fail," she whispered, pretending to be the ghost he needed. "You held the roof up, Silas. You survived." "I'm cold," he whimpered. "It's so dark." "Look at me," Ilara commanded gently. She leaned into the firelight. She let the glow illuminate her face, the good side and the bad. The scar shone silver and pink in the dancing light. Silas blinked, his eyes focused on the scar. In his delirium, he reached up. His calloused fingertips brushed the jagged line of the burn. "Fire," he breathed. "You touched the fire." "Yes," Ilara said softly. "I survived the fire, and you will survive the ice." "Not Mary," he murmured, his eyes clearing just a fraction. "Not Mary. You're the scarred one." "Ilara," she corrected him. "Your wife." "Wife," he repeated, tasting the word. "Strong," he sighed, his hand dropping to the quilt. The tension went out of his frame. The fever was breaking, the crisis passing into sleep. Ilara didn't move. She sat there all night, listening to the wind howl, listening to the rattle in his chest smooth out into a deep, rhythmic breathing. When dawn broke, grey and cold, the storm had stopped. Ilara stood up. Her legs were stiff. She looked at the woodbox, empty. She looked at the window. The barn was buried to the eaves. The animals had not been fed. She put on her coat. She put on Silas's heavy gloves, which swallowed her hands. She went out. She shoveled a path to the barn. She climbed into the loft and threw down hay for the cows. She broke the ice on the trough. She calmed the stallion, speaking to him in low, soothing tones until he stopped pacing. When she returned to the cabin, shaking with exhaustion, Silas was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, his face pale, watching the door. He saw her come in, covered in snow, smelling of the barn. He saw the shovel in her hand. He looked at the empty woodbox, then at the fire that was still burning because she had restocked it from the pile outside. Ilara dropped the shovel. She walked to the hearth and warmed her hands. "Stock is fed," she said, her voice raspy. "Stallion is calm." I braced the broken rail. Silas stared at her. He remembered the night. He remembered the pain, the cold, and the voice that had pulled him back from the dark. He remembered her dragging him, a woman half his weight, hauling him through a blizzard. He looked at her face. The scar was red from the cold. For the first time since she had met him, the stone cracked. "Ilara," he croaked. She turned. "Come here." She walked to the mattress. She knelt beside him. Silas reached out. His hand was shaking, but not from fever. He took her hand, the one with the gold band on it. He brought it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, rough and chapped. Then he reached up and touched her cheek. He traced the scar with his thumb, running it down the line of the burn that the town had called monstrous. "I thought I bought a worker," Silas whispered, his slate eyes wet. "I thought I bought a signature." He looked deep into her eyes. "But I think the mountain sent me an anchor." Ilara felt a tear slip down her cheek, tracking over the scar. "I told you, Silas, I don't break." "No," Silas agreed, his thumb resting gently on her marred skin. "You don't, and neither will we." He pulled her down just a little until her forehead rested against his. "Rest now, wife," he whispered. "I've got the watch." And in the silence of the snowbound cabin, with the fire popping and the smell of hay and healing in the air, Ilara closed her eyes and realized that the contract she had signed for food had just been rewritten in blood and bond. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The thaw did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the violent, cracking groan of the earth waking up from a 6-month coma. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Ilara and Silas in a fragile, healing peace, was shattered by the roar of the creek. Swollen with black meltwater and sludge, it tore through the ravine below the cabin like a gouge in the mountain, carrying boulders the size of wagons in its frothing jaw. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of two people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp green scent of pine resin warming in the sun. Silas sat on the heavy oak bench near the door, his legs stretched out stiffly. The ribs he had broken in the barn were knitting, but they were an angry, grinding cage around his lungs that pulled tight every time the barometric pressure dropped. He was cleaning his rifle, a heavy Winchester 1873 that gleamed with oil in the morning light. Scrape, oil, click. The rhythm was soothing, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on the window, watching the steam rise from the melting snow in the yard. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of solitude and perimeter checks, were screaming. The jays had stopped scolding in the spruce trees. The squirrels had vanished. The mountain was holding its breath. Elara was on the porch. She was beating a rug, the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack echoing off the canyon walls. She wasn't the skeletal ghost Silas had bought in the mud. Her cheeks had filled out, flushed with the heat of the fire and the steady diet of venison stew. She moved with a confidence now, a woman who knew the creak of every floorboard and the temper of the stove. She stopped beating the rug. Her hands hovered over the fabric. She turned to the door. "Silas, quiet," he rasped, setting the rifle down, but keeping his hand on the stock. He stood up, wincing as his ribs protested the sudden movement. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim, grey twilight of the overcast morning. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. That brooked no argument. Now, Elara didn't ask questions. She dropped the rug and stepped through the doorway, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "Mud," Silas said, peering through the crack in the heavy shutter. Boots in the mud. Too many of them. Down in the yard, emerging from the tree line like wraiths of dirty smoke, were 6 riders. They were picking their way up the treacherous, slushy path, their horses blowing hard in the thin air. The mud sucked at the hooves, a wet, sloppy sound that amplified the tension. Leading them, riding a gelding that looked too fine for the terrain, was Mayor Josiah Pims. He wore a city suit that was splattered with muck, and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the jagged peaks. But the men flanking him were not ridiculous. They were hard men, hired guns from the railhead with dead eyes and holsters tied low on their thighs. "He's back," Silas growled, the vibration of his voice rattling the window pane. "The vulture came to pick the bones." Elara went pale, her hand flying to the scar on her face, a reflex she hadn't fully unlearned. "The mayor? But we signed the papers. We are married." "He doesn't care about the paper," Silas said, chambering around. Clack thud. "He cares about the water rights, and he thinks I'm too broken to stop him." "Kincaid." Pim's voice echoed off the canyon walls, thin and reedy. "Silas Kincaid! I know you're in there, and I know you have the woman." Silas didn't answer. He motioned for Elara to get behind the heavy oak table. "Come out, Kincaid!" Pim shouted, wiping mud from his cheek with a silk handkerchief. "The game is up. We checked the registry in Blackwater. We know you bought her. A transaction, Silas, not a marriage. That makes it fraud." He signaled to the men behind him. They spread out, rifles resting casually across their saddles. The widowers. "Tax stands!" Pim shrieked, his greed getting the better of his caution. "A man with no kin can't hold 3,000 acres, and a bought whore doesn't count as kin." Silas stiffened. The insult hit him harder than the kick from the stallion. He looked at Elara. She was huddled behind the table, her eyes wide, terrified. But she wasn't crying. She was looking at the shotgun hanging over the mantel, the heavy, double-barreled coach gun he used for wolves. "I have to go out," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "If they fire on the house, the logs will hold, but the windows won't." "Silas, your ribs," Elara whispered. "You can barely walk." "I don't need to run," Silas said. "I just need to stand." He opened the door. He stepped out onto the porch. He looked like death warmed over. His face was grey with pain, his movement stiff and hitched. But the Winchester in his hands was steady as a rock. "Get off my land," Silas roared. The sound tore at his damaged lungs, but it came out with the force of a landslide. Pims laughed. "Look at him, boys. He's half dead already. The winter broke him." "This marriage is annulled," Pims declared, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket and waving it. "By order of the town council, you are a bachelor, Kincaid, and this land is forfeit." "I am a husband," Silas said, leveling the rifle. "And this land is defended." "Grab the girl!" Pim screamed to his men. "Drag her out! Let's see if the wife can prove she's anything but a vagrant." One of the hired guns, a man with a scarred nose and a cruel grin, spurred his horse forward. He uncoiled a lasso. "Here, Kitty, Kitty," the gunman taunted. "Come out, Scarface. Let's see what you're worth." The world disintegrated. Silas didn't. Wait, he didn't warn. He fired. Crack. The Winchester spat flame. The gunman with the lasso jerked backward, his shoulder exploding in a spray of red mist. He tumbled from the saddle, landing in the mud with a wet thud. "Kill him!" Pims shrieked, his horse rearing in panic. "Kill the cripple!" 5 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the porch, deadly as shrapnel. A slug punched through the doorframe inches from Silas's head, showering him with dust. Silas dropped to one knee, gritting his teeth against the agony in his ribs. He worked the lever of the Winchester. Click, clack, bang. Another rider grabbed his thigh, screaming, but there were too many of them. Bullets were chewing up the porch decking. Silas was pinned. He couldn't move fast enough to find cover. "Flank him!" a gunman yelled. "Get around the side! Burn him out!" 2 men dismounted and ran toward the side of the cabin, hugging the wall, where Silas couldn't see them. They carried torches, rags soaked in kerosene. Silas swore. He tried to turn, but his broken ribs locked up. He gasped, his vision swimming. He was too slow. The men reached the porch steps. One of them, a giant with a beard like wire, vaulted the rail. He raised his pistol, aiming at the back of Silas's head. "Good night, Stone Man," the gunman sneered. Boom! The sound was not the crack of a rifle. It was the roar of a cannon. The gunman flew backward as if kicked by a mule. The blast from the 12-gauge shotgun caught him full in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him into the mud of the yard. Silas spun around, ignoring the scream of his bones. Ilara stood in the doorway. She held the heavy coach gun with both hands. The recoil had bruised her shoulder, but she didn't drop it. Her eyes were wide, fierce, and terrifying. The scar on her face was blazing red, but she wasn't hiding it. She was bearing it like war paint. "I am Mrs. Kincaid," she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "And this is my home." She cracked the breech of the shotgun, ejected the spent shell, and fumbled in her apron for a fresh one. Her hands were shaking, but they were moving. The second flanker, seeing his partner obliterated, hesitated. He looked at the woman. He looked at the scarred face that Pims had mocked. He looked at the black bore of the shotgun swinging toward him. "She's crazy!" he yelled, dropping his torch. "Let's go!" "Stand your ground!" Pims shouted from the safety of the tree line. "She's just a girl!" "She's a wolf!" the gunman yelled. Back scrambling for his horse, Silas used the distraction. He stood up. He worked the lever. Click, clack. He aimed at Pim's horse. Not the man, but the beast. He fired. The bullet struck the mud right between the gelding's hooves. The horse, already panicked by the shotgun blast, bolted. It reared, turned, and galloped down the trail, nearly throwing the mare into the slush. "Retreat!" Pims wailed, clinging to the mane of his horse. "Regroup! This isn't over, Kincaid!" The remaining hired guns didn't need to be told twice. They had come for easy money and a broken man. They had found a fortress defended by a demon and a banshee. They wheeled their mounts and spurred them hard, slipping and sliding down the mountain trail, leaving their wounded groaning in the mud. Silas stood on the porch, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a crushing wave of pain. He leaned against the porch post, the Winchester slipping from his numb fingers. The silence returned to the mountain. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of winter. It was the ringing, sulphurous silence of a battlefield. Ilara lowered the shotgun. She stepped out onto the porch, her boots crunching on the glass and splinters. She looked at the bodies in the yard. She looked at the smoke drifting from the dropped torch. Then she looked at Silas. He was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, clutching his side. A dark stain was spreading on his shirt, where a splinter or a graze had caught him. "Ilara," he wheezed. She dropped the gun. She ran to him. She caught him just as his knees gave way. "I've got you," she whispered, taking his weight just as she had in the blizzard. "I've got you, Silas." "You," he gasped, looking at her with eyes that held a mixture of awe and terror. "You shot him." "He was going to kill you," Ilara said, simply. "I told you, Silas. I work for my keep." She pulled his arm over her shoulder. "Inside," she commanded, "before the cold takes the wound." They stumbled back into the cabin, the heavy door slamming shut on the carnage outside, sealing them back into the dim, smoky sanctuary that was no longer just a shelter, but a stronghold they had bled to keep. The heavy oak door slammed shut, severing the connection between the blood-soaked snow of the yard and the dim, smoky sanctuary of the cabin. The silence that followed was instant and ringing, punctuated only by the heavy, ragged breathing of two people who had just looked death in the eye and spat in its face. Ilara didn't stop moving. She guided Silas to the bench by the fire, her shoulder under his arm, taking the brunt of his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and exhaustion, but she didn't buckle. She lowered him onto the wood, her hands moving immediately to the buttons of his shirt. "Stay still," she commanded, her voice trembling not with fear but with the aftershocks of adrenaline. "I'm fine," Silas wheezed, swatting weakly at her hands. "Just the ribs talking again." "The ribs don't bleed," Ilara countered, ripping his shirt open. There, just above his hip, was a long, angry furrow where a bullet had grazed him. It wasn't deep enough to kill, but it was ugly, weeping blood onto his waistband. Ilara turned to the stove. The water she had been boiling for coffee was still hot. She grabbed a clean rag and the jar of turpentine from the shelf. "This will bite," she warned. She pressed the rag to the wound. Silas hissed, his back arching, his hand gripping the edge of the bench until the knuckles turned white. He didn't scream. He just let out a low, guttural groan that vibrated in his chest. Ilara worked with a fierce, terrifying focus. She cleaned the powder burns from his skin. She poured the turpentine. She bound the wound with strips of linen she tore from her own petticoat, wrapping his torso tight to support the ribs. When she was finished, she didn't pull away. She stood between his knees, her hands resting on his bare shoulders, her forehead slick with sweat. Silas looked up at her. His face was grey with pain, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the soot on her cheek. He looked at the shotgun leaning against the wall, the weapon she had used to save his life. He reached up. His hand, shaking slightly, touched the scar on her face. "You should have run," he rasped. "When the shooting started, you should have run into the trees." "And left you?" Ilara asked, her voice quiet. "I am a stone," Silas whispered. "Stones don't need saving. But you, God, Ilara, you stood in the door. You stood in the fire." He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He stood up, swaying. "Sit down, Silas," Ilara ordered. "No." He limped to the hearth. He knelt, groaning, and pried up a loose stone on the hearth. He pulled out a heavy iron box. He carried it to the table and set it down. It hit the wood with a dull, heavy thud that spoke of density. He opened it. Inside lay stacks of gold eagles, silver dollars, and a thick roll of banknotes. It was the savings of a lifetime, the money he had made from the cattle drives before the winter closed in. He pushed the box toward her. "Take it," Silas said. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the floor, at the bloodstains, at anything but her. Ilara froze. "What is this?" "The contract," Silas said, his voice hard and brittle. "You fulfilled it. You kept the fire. You cooked the meals. And today? Today you saved the land. You did more than any wife. You earned every cent in this box." He took a breath, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Pims is gone, but he'll send others. Or the winter will come back, or the wolves. This mountain is a grinder, Ilara. It chews up soft things." He looked at her then, and the misery in his eyes was bottomless. "You aren't a monster. You're a queen. And you don't belong in a fortress with a man who attracts bullets. Take the gold, take the buckboard, go to San Francisco, find a doctor who can fix the scar if you want, find a life where you don't have to hold a shotgun." He gestured to the door. "Go, be free, you paid your debt." Ilara stared at the gold. It was a fortune. Enough to buy a house, a dress shop, a new face. She looked at the door. The wind was picking up outside, whistling through the bullet holes in the logs. Then she looked at Silas. She saw the man who had picked her up out of the mud when the whole town had spat on her. She saw the man who had covered her with his own coat. She saw the man who was trying to break his own heart to save hers. She walked to the table. She picked up the box. Silas watched her, his jaw set, waiting for her to leave. "It's right," he told himself. "She deserves safety." Ilara walked to the stove. She opened the iron door of the firebox. She didn't throw the box in. Gold doesn't burn. Instead, she turned and walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped out onto the porch. Silas limped after her. "Ilara!" She walked to the edge of the railing, overlooking the deep snow of the canyon. She turned the box over. Clatter, ring, splash. The gold coins rained down into the abyss. The banknotes fluttered like dying moths in the wind, spiraling down into the darkness of the ravine. She emptied it all, every cent, every ticket to a soft life. She dropped the empty iron box into the snow. She turned back to Silas. He stood in the doorway, his mouth open, his face pale. You crazy woman. That was everything." Ilara walked up to him. She didn't stop until she was toe-to-toe with the giant. She reached up. She grabbed the lapels of his torn shirt. She yanked him down, or tried to. He slumped, his knees giving way under the weight of her intensity. "That was metal," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "That was cold, hard metal. I don't want it." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You think I stayed for the money? You think I fought those men for a paycheck?" She shook him gently. "I was begging in the mud, Silas. I was invisible. You saw me. You gave me a name. You gave me a fire." She pressed her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. "I didn't sign a contract for the land, Silas. I signed it for life. I am not a worker you can pay off and fire. I am your wife." Silas stood frozen. He felt the heat of her skin. He felt the steady beat of her heart against his ribs. "But the scar," he choked out. "The world. They'll stare. They'll say I bought a monster." Ilara pulled back. She tilted her head, exposing the jagged burn to the grey light. "Let them stare," she said fiercely. "Let them look at the scar. And then let them look at the man who kisses it." Silas broke. Sound that was half sob, half laugh ripped out of his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, the bad ribs protesting, but he didn't care, and lifted her off the floor. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of gunpowder and soap. "My wife," he groaned. "My Ilara." He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It wasn't the kiss of a stranger sealing a deal. It was a claiming. He kissed her mouth, desperate and hungry. Then he pulled back. He looked at her scar. He leaned in. He pressed his lips to the jagged pink skin on her cheek. He kissed the ridge of the burn. He kissed the weeping eye. He kissed the pain away. "I vow to you," he whispered against her skin, "I will rebuild the porch. I will fill the barn. And I will never, ever ask you to leave again." Ilara closed her eyes, holding him tight. "Shut up, cowboy," she whispered, a smile breaking through the tears. "And come inside. The soup is getting cold." Epilogue. 2 years later. The summer sun in the high country was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the alpine meadow behind the cabin into a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and fireweed. The cabin had changed. The logs were no longer black with age. They were chinked with fresh, bright clay. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, filled with rocking chairs and drying herbs. The barn was full. The lowing of cattle and the stomp of horses filled the air with the music of prosperity. Silas Kincaid stood by the fence, watching a new foal take its first wobbly steps. He was older, the grey in his beard more pronounced, but the hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, watchful peace. He wore a shirt that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric, a quilt of care. The screen door banged open. Ilara stepped out. She wore a dress of soft, yellow calico, the color of a dandelion. She didn't wear a scarf. She hadn't worn one in 2 years. Her face was bare to the sun, the scar silver and shining, a badge of honor. She carried a tray with lemonade. But she wasn't alone. Clinging to her skirts was a toddler, a boy with wild black hair and eyes the color of slate. He was dragging a wooden horse Silas had carved for him. "Da!" the boy shouted, pointing at the foal. Silas turned. His face split into a grin that transformed him from stone to sunlight. He vaulted the fence, ribs long-heeled, and scooped the boy up. "Look at him, Jack," Silas said, pointing to the foal. "He's finding his legs." Ilara walked up to them, handing Silas a glass. She rested her head on his shoulder. "Mayor Pims is back in town," she mentioned casually, looking at the valley below. "Running for re-election," Silas laughed. "Let him run. He knows the road up here, and he knows what's waiting at the top." He looked at his wife. He looked at the scar that he traced every night before sleep. He looked at the son who would inherit the mountain. "I need a worker," he teased gently, nudging her. "Fence needs mending." Ilara swatted his arm, her eyes dancing. "You have hands for that, Mr. Kincaid. Men who smell like wet dogs." "Aye," Silas agreed, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "But I only have one wife." They stood together. On the porch of the home they had carved out of the ice, watching the sun set over a kingdom that wasn't built on gold or fear, but on the stubborn, unbreakable promise of 2 people who had refused to freeze.